Every small town hides a story that no one wants to tell, locked behind whispers and silent streets. Tonight, you'll discover horrors that might just change how you look at familiar places, testing your nerves and leaving you with chills that last long after the final story ends. Stick around for the twists and secrets only true horror fans will uncover. And make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next spine-tingling mystery. The night stretched endlessly, a black curtain smothering the Great Plains highway ahead. I was driving alone, my headlights cutting through the darkness like knives, when I spotted her, or rather him, standing by the roadside. It was unusual to see anyone out here at this late hour, especially on this stretch of Nebraska road, miles from the nearest town. But there he was, a young man, drenched in rain despite the clear sky, thumbing a ride with a lost look in his eyes. Most people would have passed him by, too wary of strange hitchhikers at night. But something in his desperate stance made me slow down and pull over. He climbed into the passenger seat without a word, shaking like a leaf, water dripping from his soaked jacket onto the floor mats. I asked him where he was headed, but he only murmured a distant name I hadn't heard before. Whitmore, a town I barely knew existed. His voice was quiet but trembling, and when he looked at me, those eyes seemed haunted by something beyond mere fear, as if he was carrying a secret that weighed heavier than the storm clouds. The road stretched ahead, empty and dark. For miles we drove in silence, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the rhythmic swish of tires on wet asphalt. I tried to make conversation, but he just stared out the window into the night, his face pale under the faint glow of the dashboard. I caught glimpses of bruises on his hands, dirt beneath his nails, scars that told a story of pain and struggle. As we neared a sharp curve beside an old, creaking bridge, he suddenly turned to me with a voice so low it was almost a whisper. "You need to stop, right here." I frowned but slowed down, pulling the car to the side near a dimly lit barricade. It's not safe to go any further. My heart thudded hard in my chest. "What do you mean? We've got miles to go." He didn't answer, only pointed toward the fog rolling thick over the bridge like a living thing. In that moment, a cold wind swept through the car, chilling me to the bone. I glanced at his seat, and it was empty. My breath hitched. Panic surged through every inch of me as I looked around, half expecting him to be hiding somewhere nearby, playing a cruel prank. But there was no sign. No one. Only my own ragged breathing, the eerie silence settling back over the road. My fingers shook as I grabbed my phone to call for help, only to find no signal. It was like the place had swallowed any connection to the outside world. Then, from the shadows beneath the bridge, a faint murmuring reached my ears. Soft, persistent, like a warning whispered on the wind. I leaned out the window, trying to see. And then I saw it. Flickering lights, pale and ghostly, floating just above the water below the old wooden planks. They weren't fireflies or reflections. They moved with intention, forming shapes that seemed almost human. My mind raced. Stories came flooding back, old tales my grandmother warned me about when I was a child. The story of the Whitmore hitchhiker, a young man who died in a tragic accident on this very bridge years ago. His body claimed by the river during a terrible storm. They said his spirit still roamed these roads, looking for a ride to safety, forever trapped between life and death. Was that what I had picked up? Had I been driving with a ghost unseen by the world but ever present, desperate to be found? The thought sent a shiver colder than the night air down my spine. Compelled by something I couldn't explain, I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under my feet as I edged closer to the edge of the bridge. The water below churned violently despite the calm night, glowing faintly as if lit from within. The temperature dropped further, and my breath formed clouds I could see drifting away into the dark. Suddenly, a hand, cold and wet, grabbed my wrist. I gasped, whirling around, but no one was there. The feeling lingered, a chilling reminder that I was not alone. Frozen, my eyes scanned the mist, catching a shadow, a boyish figure staring back, eyes wide and pleading. He opened his mouth seemingly to speak, but instead, a rush of wind swept past, carrying a name that echoed against the riverbanks. Donovan. I stumbled back into the car, the door slamming behind me as if forced by an unseen force. The engine wouldn't start. Panic gripped me like a vice. In the distance, lights flashed. Police or rescue, I wasn't sure. But the hope brought a surge of strength. I pounded the steering wheel, willing the car to move. When the engine finally roared to life, a rush of relief washed over me as I sped away from the bridge. But as I looked in the rearview mirror, the silhouette of the hitchhiker appeared once more, standing at the bridge edge, watching, waiting. Since that night, I haven't driven that road after dark. Some shadows are better left unseen. But sometimes, when the wind is just right and the dark settles deep over the Great Plains, I swear I still hear his voice whisper my name, asking for one last ride home. What would you do if you picked up a stranger who disappeared before your eyes, only to leave behind a warning that chills you for a lifetime? There's a church in a small Kansas town called Whitmore, a place you've probably never heard of, and one you'd never think to visit. But if you ever find yourself wandering the cracked sidewalks and faded storefronts of that forgotten place, and if the wind is steady enough to carry the silence, you might just hear the quietest sound of all. Nothing. No birds chirping, no leaves rustling, no distant hum of cars or voices. Just silence. Not peaceful silence, but a silence that smothers everything. It's the kind of silence that presses into your ears so heavily, you can't help but feel like you're being watched. Like the absence of noise is a warning, rather than a comfort. I found Whitmore Church on a cold autumn afternoon, years ago. I was passing through Kansas on a road trip, chasing old stories and places off the beaten path. I liked abandoned buildings, places where time felt like it stopped and ghosts might still whisper in the corners. The church looked like any small-town chapel on the outside. Red brick walls, stained glass windows dulled by dust. The faded name, Whitmore Baptist, barely readable under years of grime. But the moment I stepped inside, everything changed. The door creaked under my hand as I pushed it open, breaking the oppressive quiet for a moment. But then the door shut behind me with a deafening finality. Inside, the air was thick, almost too heavy to breathe. The smell of old wood and dampness hung around, but beneath that, there was something else. Something sour and unplaceable. What struck me first was the sound, or rather, the lack of it. I looked around, expecting to hear creaks or the distant buzz of insects, but there was nothing. No echo, no footsteps, even though I was alone. Not even my own voice when I whispered a greeting. It was like the church swallowed all sound, muting even my presence. I called out tentatively at first, my voice trembling in the space. No answer. I stepped deeper in, my boots making no noise on the cold stone floor. When I tried to whisper again, it felt like the air itself held its breath. Suddenly, I noticed the pews. They were perfectly preserved, lined up in rows as if waiting for an audience. but there was no dust, no decay. It was as if someone, or something, kept this place exactly as it was on its last memorable day. Yet, no key could have opened the locked door from the outside. I was there alone. I moved toward the altar, where a faded Bible lay open, pages yellowed and brittle, frozen mid-sentence. For a moment, I thought I heard soft murmurs, barely audible, fluttering like a breeze through the pages. I knelt down to listen closer, and then the whispers stopped entirely. The silence returned, pressing harder than before. My heart hammered in my chest. I tried to stand, but my legs felt numb, as if caught in the grip of some unseen force. A chill swept through the room, sharper than the autumn air outside. It wasn't just cold. It was a cold that tasted of fear and regret. I turned toward the stained glass windows, hoping for light, or at least a crack in the darkness. But the colors were muted and gray, as if the glass had absorbed all the joy and left only sorrow. As I stared, I saw movement, or thought I did. A shadow flickered near one of the windows, barely visible, like a silhouette of someone kneeling in prayer. I whispered again, "Is someone here?" But only silence greeted me in response. The shadow vanished. Panic began to seep in as I realized I was trapped in this soundless prison. My breathing was the only sign of life, yet even it seemed to be swallowed whole. I tried calling out louder, my voice cracking, but the church remained untouched by sound. Suddenly, the Bible's pages fluttered on their own, flipping slowly as if blown by an invisible wind. Then, a voice, low and distant, echoed in my mind, not in my ears. "Why do you disturb us?" The question was both a warning and a plea. I scrambled to my feet, my skin prickling. I turned to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. I pulled and pushed, but it held fast. I was locked in the silence. Minutes, or was it hours, passed with no way to measure time. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the door clicked open. I stumbled outside into the cold Kansas twilight, gasping for air as though I'd been underwater. I looked back at Whitmore Church from a distance. The silence seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, and the stained glass windows glowed faintly, almost beckoning. The feeling of having been in the presence of something ancient and doomed weighed on me. In the days that followed, I learned the truth about Whitmore Church. It had burned decades ago in a tragic fire that consumed the original congregation inside. But witnesses never found a body, nor could they explain why the church still stood untouched by the flames. Since then, locals claim the church only appeared on certain nights, always silent, trapping those who entered in a world where sound and time stood still. Some say it's the souls of those lost in the fire, eternally trapped and repeating their final prayers. Others believe it's a place between worlds, a haunting reminder that some tragedies refuse to fade, lingering in the spaces we overlook. Whenever I tell this story, I warn people. If you ever find yourself near Whitmore Church when the wind falls silent, don't step inside. The silence will swallow you whole, and you might never hear your own voice again. What would you do if you entered a place where even your scream vanished into nothing? I grew up in a small Oklahoma town where everyone knew everyone, and the roads were as familiar as the lines on your own palm. I'd driven every back road, every shortcut, every dusty path between fields and farms. Or at least I thought I had. It wasn't until that night in late summer, when the air hung thick and heavy with the promise of a storm, that I discovered a road I'd never seen before. A road that shouldn't have existed. I was 17, driving home from a friend's house after a late-night hangout. The sky was dark, clouds rolling in fast, and I wanted to beat the rain. I took what I thought was my usual route, a shortcut that ran parallel to the main highway, cutting through empty farmland. But somewhere along the way, I must have taken a wrong turn. The road I found myself on was unfamiliar, narrow, cracked asphalt bordered by tall grass that swayed unnaturally in the windless night. At first, I thought maybe I'd just forgotten about this stretch. But the deeper I drove, the stranger it became. The road seemed to dip lower and lower, as if descending into the earth itself. My headlights caught glimpses of old, rusted fence posts and trees that looked twisted and dead, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air inside my car grew cold despite the warm summer night, and a strange fog began to creep across the pavement, thick and gray, swirling in patterns that didn't make sense. Then I felt it, a wetness seeping into my shoes. I looked down and froze. Water was pooling on the floor of my car, rising slowly but steadily. My heart pounded as I checked the windows. They were rolled up tight. Where was the water coming from? I pressed harder on the gas, desperate to get off this cursed road, but the water kept rising, cold and murky, soaking through my jeans. The car began to shudder, the engine sputtering as if struggling against an unseen force. The headlights flickered, casting wild shadows across the road ahead. And then I saw it. The pavement itself seemed to be moving, rippling like the surface of a river. My tires splashed through what looked like shallow water, but it was getting deeper with every passing second. Panic clawed at my chest. I slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a stop. The water inside was now up to my ankles, freezing cold and smelling of algae and rot. I threw open the door and stumbled out, gasping for air. But what I saw made my blood run cold. I wasn't standing on a road anymore. Beneath my feet was rushing water, dark and fast-moving, churning like a river in flood. But there was no riverbed, no banks, just the endless flow of water where asphalt should have been. The fog thickened around me, and in the distance, I could hear voices. Faint, desperate cries carried on the wind. I looked back at my car. It was sinking, slowly disappearing beneath the surface of the impossible river. The headlights flickered one last time before they were swallowed by the black water. I stood there, frozen in terror, watching as everything I knew dissolved into the nightmare around me. The voices grew louder, clearer. They were calling names I didn't recognize at first. But then I heard one that made my heart stop. My own name. Over and over, echoing through the fog, someone was calling me, beckoning me deeper into the water. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The water was pulling at me, tugging at my legs, trying to drag me down. I fought against it, screaming into the night, but no sound seemed to escape my throat. The fog pressed in closer, and through it I saw shapes, figures standing in the water, their faces pale and lifeless, their eyes hollow and staring. They reached out toward me, their mouths moving in silent pleas. I recognized some of them. Faces from old photographs, stories my grandmother used to tell about people who drowned in the floods that had swept through Oklahoma decades ago. But how could they be here? How could any of this be real? Suddenly, a hand grabbed my wrist, ice cold and vice-like. I screamed and jerked away, stumbling backward. The fog parted for just a moment, and I saw her. A young woman, her hair plastered to her face, her clothes tattered and soaked. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but instead, water poured out, black and thick, splashing at my feet. I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going or how I'd get there. I just ran. The water splashed around me, soaking me to the bone, but I kept moving, lungs burning, legs aching. Behind me, the voices grew into a roar, a chorus of the drowned crying out in rage and sorrow. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The water vanished. The fog lifted. I found myself standing on dry pavement, gasping for breath, my clothes soaked and my body trembling. I looked around. I was back on the main highway, just a few miles from home. My car was nowhere to be seen. I walked the rest of the way home in the dark, shivering and confused. When I finally stumbled through the front door, my parents rushed to me, asking where I'd been, why I was soaking wet. But I couldn't answer. How could I explain what I'd seen? How could I make them believe that I'd driven on a road that didn't exist? That I'd been swallowed by a river that wasn't there? The next day, I went back to look for that road. I drove every route, every shortcut, every turn I could remember. But there was nothing. No narrow road, no twisted trees, no sign that any of it had ever existed. It was as if the entire experience had been erased from the world, except for the water stains still visible on my shoes and the cold, lingering fear that never quite left me. I later learned from my grandmother about the Great Plains floods of the 1950s, devastating floods that had swept through Oklahoma, washing away entire roads and claiming dozens of lives. Some of those roads were never rebuilt, buried beneath new construction and forgotten by time. But the stories remained, stories of drivers who'd taken wrong turns and found themselves on phantom roads, roads that only appeared on certain nights, roads that remembered the water and the dead. I never told anyone the full story. They wouldn't have believed me anyway. But I know what I saw, what I felt. That road exists somewhere, waiting for the next lost traveler to take a wrong turn. And when it appears again, the water will rise, the voices will call, and someone else will have to fight their way back to the world of the living. What would you do if you found yourself driving on a road that pulled you into a nightmare you couldn't escape? Growing up in the Dakotas, you learn to respect the sky. Out here on the Great Plains, weather doesn't just happen, it commands. Tornadoes don't give warnings beyond the sudden green tint in the clouds and the eerie silence that falls before all hell breaks loose. My family had lived through dozens of tornado seasons, and our storm cellar had become as familiar as our own kitchen. It was our sanctuary, our survival. But one night during the worst storm I'd ever witnessed, that cellar became something else entirely, a place where fear took on a face I'll never forget. It was late April, the kind of evening when the air feels electric and wrong. My parents, my younger sister Emma, and I had been watching the weather reports all day. The meteorologists kept talking about supercells forming to the west, rotating storms that could spawn multiple tornadoes. By dinner time, the sky had turned that sickly greenish-gray color that makes your stomach drop. My father went outside to check the horizon, and when he came back in, his face was pale. Everyone to the cellar, now. We didn't argue. We grabbed our emergency supplies, flashlights, water, blankets, and headed out the back door toward the cellar entrance. The wind had already picked up, whipping my hair across my face and carrying debris from neighbors' yards. In the distance, I could hear the sound, that freight train roar that everyone talks about, but you can never truly understand until you hear it yourself. My father yanked open the heavy wooden doors, and we scrambled down the concrete steps into the darkness below. The cellar smelled like damp earth and old wood, a scent I'd known my whole life, but that night seemed more oppressive than usual. My mother clicked on the battery-powered lantern, casting shadows across the cramped space lined with shelves of canned goods and emergency supplies. That's when Emma screamed. In the far corner of the cellar, huddled against the cold concrete wall, was a man. He was soaking wet, though it hadn't started raining yet. His clothes were plastered to his thin frame, and mud caked his hands and face. His hair hung in wet strands over his eyes, and he was shaking violently, his arms wrapped around his knees. My father immediately stepped in front of us, his voice sharp and commanding. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" The man didn't respond. He just stared at us with wide, terrified eyes that seemed to look right through us. His lips were moving, forming words we couldn't hear over the growing roar of the wind outside. The cellar doors rattled violently above us as the storm intensified. "Answer me," my father demanded. But the stranger only continued his silent muttering, rocking back and forth like a child. My mother pulled Emma and me closer, her grip tight on our shoulders. "Maybe he's hurt," she whispered. "Maybe he needed shelter and found our cellar open." But I knew that wasn't possible. My father always kept that cellar locked with a heavy padlock. There was no way someone could have gotten in without breaking it. And the lock had been intact when we came down. Thunder exploded overhead, so loud it felt like the earth itself was splitting open. The lantern flickered, casting wild shadows across the stranger's face. In that brief moment of unstable light, I saw something that made my blood run cold. His eyes weren't just terrified, they were empty, hollow like looking into an abyss, and his skin, beneath all that mud, had a strange, grayish pallor that didn't look quite human. "Please," the man finally whispered, his voice barely audible beneath the storm's rage. "Please don't let it take me again." "Don't let what take you?" my father asked, his tone softening slightly, though I could hear the tremor of fear beneath it. The stranger lifted one muddy hand and pointed upward toward the cellar doors. "It's out there, in the wind. It's looking for me. It always finds me." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold cellar air. Emma was crying quietly against my mother's side. The storm was directly overhead now, the roar so deafening we could barely hear ourselves think. The cellar doors shook violently, and I was certain they would rip off their hinges at any moment. Then, just as suddenly as the chaos had reached its peak, everything stopped. The wind died. The roar ceased. An unnatural silence fell over us, more terrifying than the storm itself. In that silence, we could hear the stranger's labored breathing, wet and ragged. My father slowly approached him, extending a hand. "Come on, let's get you warmed up. The worst is past." But as my father's hand neared the stranger, the man let out a blood-curdling scream and pressed himself harder against the wall. "No, it's not over. It's never over." Lightning struck so close that the flash of light penetrated through the cracks in the cellar doors, illuminating everything in stark white brilliance. In that instant, I saw the stranger clearly, and what I saw made me grab my mother's arm in terror. His reflection in the small mirror on our emergency supply shelf showed nothing. The space where he should have been was empty. The light faded, plunging us back into the lantern's dim glow. When my eyes adjusted, the corner where the stranger had been huddled was empty. He was gone, vanished, as if he'd never been there at all. But the wet footprints remained, trailing from the corner to the center of the cellar, then stopping abruptly. And in the dirt floor, scratched in desperate, jagged letters, were words that made my heart stop. Help me, 1967. My father stood frozen, staring at the message. My mother pulled us toward the stairs, her face drained of all color. We need to leave, now. But the storm, my father started. Now, she insisted. We climbed the stairs and pushed open the cellar doors. Outside, the sky was clearing, stars beginning to peek through the dissipating clouds. The storm had passed, leaving behind only scattered debris and the smell of rain-soaked earth. Our house stood untouched. Everything seemed normal, except for the terror still coursing through our veins. That night, after we'd convinced ourselves we were safe, my father did something I'd never seen him do before. He went to the old trunk in the attic where my grandfather's things were stored and pulled out yellowed newspaper clippings. He spread them across the kitchen table, his hands shaking. One article caught my eye immediately. The headline read, "Local man lost in tornado, body never found." The date was April 28, 1967. The photograph showed a young man, thin and haunted-looking, standing in front of a farmhouse I recognized. Our farmhouse. According to the article, he'd been a drifter passing through during one of the worst tornado outbreaks in Dakota history. Witnesses said he'd been seeking shelter when the tornado struck. They'd found his muddy jacket tangled in debris miles away, but his body was never recovered. The man's name was Michael Garrett, and in the grainy black and white photograph, his eyes held that same hollow, terrified look I'd seen in our cellar. My father closed the newspaper clipping with trembling hands. "He's been down there before," he said quietly. "When I was a boy, during a storm in '78, my father told me he'd seen a wet stranger in the cellar who disappeared when lightning struck. He thought he'd imagined it. We never used that storm cellar again. My father built a new one on the other side of the property the following year. But sometimes, during tornado season, when the sky turns that particular shade of green and the wind begins to howl, I think about Michael Garrett. I wonder if he's still down there, trapped in an endless loop of terror, forever seeking shelter from a storm that claimed him decades ago. And I wonder if he'll ever find peace, or if he's doomed to huddle in that corner for eternity, waiting for the moment when lightning strikes and he vanishes once more into whatever hell keeps pulling him back. What would you do if you found someone hiding in your shelter? Someone who shouldn't exist, someone who's been dead for decades, still running from the storm that took their life? Every neighborhood has that one house, the one kids dare each other to approach on Halloween, the one that sits a little darker than the others, even in broad daylight, the one that makes people cross to the other side of the street without quite knowing why. In my small South Dakota town, that house sat at the end of Maple Street, a 2-story Victorian with peeling paint and windows that seemed to watch you as you passed. But what made it truly strange wasn't just its appearance. It was the fact that our mailman, a man who'd walked every street in town for 30 years, refused to go near it. I was 11 when I first noticed. I'd wake up early some mornings and watch Mr. Henderson make his rounds, his blue uniform crisp despite the summer heat, his stride steady and purposeful. But when he reached the house at the end of Maple Street, he would stop at the property line, stare at the rusted mailbox for a long moment, then turn around and continue his route without delivering anything, every single time. One day, curiosity got the better of me. I ran outside and called to him. "Mr. Henderson, you forgot that house." He turned to me, his weathered face suddenly pale. "No, son, I didn't forget." Then he walked away without another word, his pace quicker than usual. That exchange haunted me for weeks. What could make a man who'd served in Vietnam, who'd worked through blizzards and storms, afraid of a simple house? The question consumed me, until finally, one late August afternoon, I decided I needed to know. I grabbed my bike and pedaled to the end of Maple Street, my heart pounding harder with every rotation of the wheels. The house looked worse up close. The porch sagged in the middle, and the front door hung slightly askew on its hinges. Ivy had overtaken most of the first floor, creeping up the walls like grasping fingers. But what struck me most were the windows. They weren't boarded up or broken. They were intact, clean even, which seemed impossible given the state of everything else. And behind the glass, I could swear I saw curtains moving, though there wasn't any wind. The mailbox stood at the edge of the property, overflowing with yellowed envelopes and advertisements that must have accumulated for years. I don't know what possessed me, but I dismounted my bike and approached it. My hands trembled as I reached for the contents, half expecting something to reach back. That's when I heard it, a creaking sound from the house. The front door was opening. Slowly, deliberately. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. Through the widening gap, I saw only darkness, a black void that seemed to pulse with its own life. Then came the whisper. My name. Clear as day, carried on a breeze that didn't exist. Come inside. We've been waiting. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my bike. The door remained open, that darkness beckoning, and I swear I could see shapes moving within it. Figures that weren't quite solid, weren't quite there. I grabbed my bike and pedaled away so fast, my lungs burned, not daring to look back until I was safe in my own driveway. But the house had gotten into my head. Over the following weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I asked around town, trying to learn its history. Most people gave vague answers or changed the subject. But finally, Mrs. Chen at the library took pity on me. She led me to the archives and pulled out a folder marked Maple Street Properties. What I learned chilled me to my core. The house had been built in 1923 by a photographer named Elias Winters. He'd been obsessed with capturing what he called the truth beneath the surface. Photographs that revealed not just a person's face, but their soul, their past, their future. According to newspaper clippings, people who sat for his portraits reported disturbing experiences. Seeing themselves in the photographs doing things they'd never done, appearing in places they'd never been. Or worst of all, seeing their own deaths captured in the frozen image. The town had dismissed it as superstition until 1947, when Elias disappeared. His house was found abandoned, but inside, covering every wall of every room, were photographs. Hundreds of them, thousands. And every single one showed the same thing. Townsfolk from the present, past, and future, captured in moments that couldn't exist. People who hadn't been born yet. People who died decades earlier, all frozen in silver and paper. The authorities removed the photographs and tried to burn them, but witnesses claimed the images wouldn't catch fire. They were eventually buried in an unmarked location outside town. The house was left to rot, but stories persisted. People who entered reported seeing photographs still hanging on the walls, even though the house had been emptied. Photographs of themselves. Mrs. Chen closed the folder and looked at me with serious eyes. That's why Mr. Henderson won't go near it. He made the mistake of going inside once, 20 years ago. He saw a photograph of himself, and in it, he wasn't alone. There was something standing behind him, something with no face. He's been terrified ever since, waiting to see if what the photograph showed would come true. I should have left it alone. I should have accepted the story and moved on. But teenage curiosity is a powerful, stupid thing. 2 nights later, armed with a flashlight and false courage, I returned to the house. The door was still open, just as I'd left it, that same darkness waiting inside. I stepped across the threshold. The smell hit me first. Old paper, chemicals, something sweet and rotting. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing walls stripped bare of everything except rectangular outlines where frames had once hung. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, unmarked by any footprints. I was alone, or so I thought. As I moved deeper into the house, my light caught something on the far wall of what must have been the living room. A photograph. A single frame, hanging perfectly straight despite everything. I approached it slowly, every nerve in my body screaming danger. The photograph showed Maple Street. My street. But something was wrong. The image was old, sepia-toned, but it showed modern cars parked along the road, and standing in the middle of the street, clear as day, was me. Not as I was then, but older, maybe in my 30s. I was looking directly at the camera with an expression of absolute terror. And behind me, just barely visible in the photograph's shadows, was a figure. Tall, impossibly thin, with no features where its face should be. My flashlight flickered. In that moment of darkness, I heard breathing that wasn't my own. When the light returned, the photograph had changed. I was no longer alone in the frame. Standing next to my future self was my present self, the boy I was at that moment, wearing the exact clothes I had on, holding the exact flashlight in my hand. I ran. I crashed through that house, slamming into walls in the darkness, my flashlight beam wild and useless. Behind me, I heard footsteps matching my own, the click of a camera shutter, and that whisper again. We've been waiting. We've always been waiting. I burst through the front door and didn't stop running until I reached home. I never told anyone what I saw. But sometimes, even now, decades later, I think about that photograph. I think about the future version of myself, frozen in terror on Maple Street. I think about the figure with no face. And I wonder if I'm living in that moment right now, if somewhere in that abandoned house, a new photograph hangs on the wall showing exactly where I am and exactly what's standing behind me. I wonder if the future I saw has already happened, or if it's still waiting. I wonder if Elias Winters ever really disappeared, or if he's still there, in that house, adding photographs to his collection. One for every person who makes the mistake of looking. Mr. Henderson never did deliver mail to that house. He retired 3 years ago and moved out of state. I heard he still checks over his shoulder constantly, still looks for the faceless figure from his photograph. Some people say he's paranoid. But I know better. I know exactly what he's watching for. Because I'm watching for it too. What would you do if you saw a photograph of yourself that showed a moment that hasn't happened yet, and a presence that shouldn't exist standing right behind you, waiting for the future to catch up? I took the night shift job at the grain elevator outside of a small Kansas town because I needed the money and because I thought I didn't mind being alone. The pay was decent for what seemed like simple work. Monitoring equipment, checking moisture levels, making sure nothing caught fire or jammed during the overnight processing. The elevator itself was a massive concrete structure that towered over the flat Kansas landscape, visible for miles in every direction. During the day, it bustled with farmers and trucks. But at night, it belonged to whoever drew the short straw for the graveyard shift. That person was me. My first week went smoothly enough. I'd arrive at 10 in the evening, receive the handoff from the day shift supervisor, and spend the next 8 hours walking the corridors, checking gauges, and filling out logs. The building was old, built sometime in the 1950s, and it groaned and settled like all old structures do. The machinery hummed a constant background noise that became almost comforting after a while. Almost. It was during my second week that I first noticed the shadows. I was on the 3rd level, inspecting a conveyor belt that had been acting up, when my flashlight beam caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, expecting to see a rat or maybe a bird that had gotten trapped inside, but there was nothing there. Just the long corridor stretching away into darkness, my light creating harsh angles and deep pools of black. I chalked it up to exhaustion and kept working. But then it happened again, and again. Always just at the edge of my vision, always gone when I looked directly at it. A shape, darker than the surrounding darkness, that seemed to move with purpose rather than randomly. By the 3rd week, I couldn't deny it anymore. Something was following me through the grain elevator. I'd be walking down a corridor and hear footsteps behind me that stopped when I stopped. I'd climb a ladder and sense something climbing below me, matching my pace. I'd turn a corner and catch a glimpse of a figure ducking into a doorway. A human-shaped shadow that seemed to exist independent of any light source. The worst part was that it was getting closer. Each night, the shadow seemed a little more solid, a little more present. I started timing my rounds differently, taking random routes, trying to be unpredictable. But it didn't matter. The shadow always found me. I should have quit. Any sane person would have walked out and never looked back. But I needed this job. And more than that, some stubborn part of me refused to be scared away by what I kept telling myself was just my imagination. So I kept showing up, kept walking those dark corridors, kept pretending I didn't feel eyes on my back every moment. Then came the night everything changed. I was on the top level, the one closest to the massive storage bins, when the lights went out. All of them, simultaneously, plunging me into absolute darkness. The emergency lights should have kicked in immediately, but they didn't. I stood frozen, my flashlight suddenly seeming pathetically small against the vast blackness surrounding me. That's when I heard it. Breathing. Not my own, but something else. Something close enough that I could feel the air moving. My hand shook as I raised the flashlight, sweeping it in a wide arc. The beam caught dust particles floating through the air, machinery standing silent and still. And then, a shadow. But not like before. This one didn't dart away. It stood in the middle of the corridor, maybe 20 feet from me. A human-shaped silhouette that seemed to absorb my flashlight beam rather than be illuminated by it. I couldn't make out any features, no face or clothing details, just a dark outline that radiated wrongness. "Who's there?" My voice came out as a croak. "This is private property. You need to leave." The shadow didn't respond. It didn't move. But somehow, I knew it was looking at me, studying me. And then, with a movement that was both fluid and jerky, like a film skipping frames, it was closer. Not walking, just suddenly occupying a space 10 feet nearer than it had been a moment before. Terror finally broke through my stubborn denial. I ran. My boots clanged on the metal grating as I sprinted toward the nearest stairwell, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Behind me, I could hear it following, that same impossible movement, closing the distance in stuttering leaps that defied physics. I reached the stairs and practically threw myself down them, taking 3 and 4 steps at a time, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. The shadow followed, always just behind me, never quite catching up, but never falling back either. I could feel its presence, like a weight on my shoulders. Could sense its intent, even though I didn't understand it. I hit the ground floor and ran for the main entrance, my lungs burning. The door was locked from the outside, standard security protocol, but there was an emergency release. My fingers fumbled with the mechanism, and precious seconds ticked by as I struggled with the lever. The shadow was at the bottom of the stairs now, standing perfectly still, watching. The door finally gave way, and I stumbled out into the night air, gasping and shaking. I turned back to look at the elevator's entrance, half expecting the shadow to follow me outside. But it remained inside, a dark shape framed by the doorway. And for the first time, I could swear I saw details. The suggestion of a face, the hint of features that seemed somehow familiar. I didn't go back inside. I sat in my truck until dawn, watching the elevator with wide eyes, jumping at every sound. When the morning shift arrived, I tried to explain what had happened, but the words sounded crazy, even to my own ears. The supervisor checked the building and found nothing unusual. The lights were all working fine. There was no sign of any intruder. But I knew what I'd experienced, and I knew I couldn't go back. I quit that day, despite needing the money, despite the strange looks and questions. Some things aren't worth any paycheck. It wasn't until a week later that I learned the truth. I was having coffee at the town diner when an old farmer overheard me mention the grain elevator. He leaned over from the next booth, his weathered face serious. "You saw it, didn't you? The shadow?" I nodded slowly, surprised to find someone who believed me. He sighed and stirred his coffee. "There's been stories about that place since the 60s. A worker fell into one of the grain bins during the night shift. They say he suffocated in the grain before anyone found him come morning. Took 3 days to recover the body. After that, night shift workers started reporting strange things. Most don't last more than a month." "Why didn't anyone tell me?" I asked, anger mixing with my relief at finally having an explanation. "Would you have believed them? Would you have taken the job?" He shook his head. "People need work. The elevator needs workers, so we don't talk about it much. But those who've seen it know. It's looking for something, or maybe it's trying to tell us something. Some folks say it shows itself different to different people, but it's always the same shadow at its core." "What do you mean, shows itself different?" The old farmer looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "The workers who've seen it closest, who've really looked at it, they say the face in the shadow looks like them, like they're seeing themselves. Like maybe that worker who died is still there, still working the night shift, still walking those corridors, and he's trying to show every new person what he's become, what they might become if they stay too long in the dark." I thought about that moment in the doorway, when I'd finally seen the suggestion of features in the shadow. I thought about how familiar it had seemed, how the shape and posture had triggered something in my mind. And I realized with cold certainty that the old farmer was right. The face I'd almost seen in that darkness had been my own. I never went back to that grain elevator. I heard they went through 4 more night shift workers in the next 2 months. I don't know if they all saw what I saw, if they all recognized themselves in the shadow that stalks those corridors. But I know that somewhere in that towering concrete structure, something walks the night shift. Something that might have once been human, that might still be searching for a way out of its endless routine, or maybe just looking for company in the dark. And if you ever find yourself working alone at night in a place that feels wrong, If you ever see a shadow that moves like it's alive, take my advice. Don't wait to see its face. Because once you recognize yourself in that darkness, it's already too late. What would you do if you spent your nights being followed by a shadow that wore your own face? My grandmother was half Lakota, and she used to tell me stories that most people would dismiss as legends or folklore. Stories about spirits that wandered the Great Plains, about creatures that existed in the spaces between the physical and spiritual worlds. I never really believed them, not until the summer I turned 19 and made the mistake of entering a place the elders called Wendigo's Hollow. It was located in a remote part of Oklahoma, a depression in the land surrounded by twisted oak trees that never seemed to grow leaves, even in the height of summer. The locals avoided it, giving vague warnings about bad land and worse history. But I was young and stupid and convinced that I knew better than superstitious old-timers. I'd been camping with friends in the area, and when they all headed back to town for supplies, I decided to explore on my own. The hollow was about a mile from our campsite, accessible by a barely visible deer trail that wound through dense underbrush. The temperature dropped noticeably as I approached, despite the afternoon sun beating down on the plains around me. The air felt different there. Thicker, harder to breathe, carrying a smell like old meat and decay that made my stomach turn. I should have turned back then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, but pride and curiosity pushed me forward. I told myself I was being irrational, that there was nothing to fear from a simple depression in the ground. I was wrong. The trees surrounding the hollow were unlike anything I'd seen before. Their bark was pale, almost white, and covered in deep gouges that looked disturbingly like claw marks. Some of the marks were old and weathered, but others appeared fresh, the wood beneath still raw and exposed. I reached out to touch one of the gouges, and my fingers came away sticky with sap that looked too dark, too red. That's when I heard my name. It came from deep within the hollow, carried on a wind that didn't exist. The voice was familiar. It sounded exactly like my grandmother, her warm tone calling me the way she used to when I was a child. "Come here, grandson. I've been waiting for you." Relief flooded through me. My grandmother had passed away 2 years earlier, and I missed her terribly. Hearing her voice, even knowing logically that it couldn't be her, triggered something deep and emotional in me. I found myself walking toward the voice, descending into the hollow, my rational mind shut down by grief and longing. The depression was deeper than it appeared from above, and darker. The twisted trees created a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight, leaving everything in a perpetual twilight. The ground was bare dirt, packed hard and free of any vegetation. And in the center of the hollow stood a figure. From a distance, it looked like my grandmother. The same small frame, the same way of standing with one hand on her hip. But as I got closer, details started to wrong. The proportions were slightly off. The arms too long, the fingers too many, the head tilted at an angle that human necks don't quite achieve. "Grandmother?" My voice came out uncertain, hope and fear warring in my chest. The figure turned toward me, and I saw its face, or rather, the approximation of a face. It had my grandmother's features, but they were like a mask that didn't quite fit, skin stretched too tight over a skull that was the wrong shape. The eyes were the worst, black and empty, like looking into deep wells that had no bottom. "Come closer, grandson." The voice was still hers, still warm and loving. But there was something beneath it now, something hungry and cold that sent ice through my veins. I stumbled backward, finally understanding the danger I was in. This wasn't my grandmother. This was something ancient and evil, something that wore the faces and voices of loved ones to lure victims into its territory. My grandmother's stories came flooding back. The Wendigo, a creature of insatiable hunger that could never be satisfied, that consumed everything it touched and always wanted more. "You're not her," I said, my voice shaking. "You're not my grandmother." The thing that wore her face smiled, and the expression was all wrong, too wide, showing too many teeth. "No, but I knew her. I tasted her fear when she used to come here as a child. I know all the people from these lands, and now I know you." It moved toward me, and the pretense of humanity fell away. The body elongated, limbs cracking and reforming into something skeletal and gaunt. Covered in pale skin, stretched so tight I could see every bone and sinew beneath. The face melted into something else, something with a mouth that split open impossibly wide, filled with rows of yellowed teeth designed for tearing flesh. I ran. Pure terror gave me speed I didn't know I possessed. Behind me, I could hear it following, hear the crack of branches and the scrape of claws on bark. But worse than the physical sounds were the voices. It was calling to me in a dozen different tones. My grandmother, my mother, my friends, everyone I'd ever loved, all begging me to stop, to come back, to stay with them forever in the hollow. The voices were so convincing, so perfectly mimicked, that I almost stopped. Almost. But I remembered something my grandmother had told me years ago during one of her stories. The Wendigo feeds on loneliness and grief. It becomes what you miss most. But it can never truly replicate love, only the shadow of it. If you listen with your heart instead of your ears, you'll know the difference. I forced myself to really listen, to feel what was behind those voices. And she was right. Beneath the perfect imitation was nothing but emptiness and hunger, a void that wanted to consume me completely. There was no love there, no warmth, only an endless appetite that would never be satisfied. I broke through the tree line at the edge of the hollow, and the voices stopped abruptly, cut off like someone had flipped a switch. I risked a glance back and saw the creature standing at the boundary, unable or unwilling to leave the hollow. In the better light, I could see it clearly. A nightmare of pale flesh and protruding bones, with a face that kept shifting between the features of everyone I'd ever cared about. Never settling, never quite right. It stared at me with those empty black eyes. And when it spoke again, it used my own voice. "You'll come back. They always come back. The lonely ones, the grieving ones, the ones who miss someone so much they'll believe anything. You'll convince yourself it was a dream, or a hallucination, or that maybe, just maybe, you were wrong. And when you come back, I'll be waiting." I didn't stop running until I reached the campsite. My friends returned an hour later to find me throwing all my gear into my car, babbling about leaving immediately. They thought I'd lost my mind, and maybe I had, a little. We left that night, and I never went back to that part of Oklahoma. But the creature was right about one thing. There were nights, especially in the beginning, when I would wake up from dreams where my grandmother was calling me. Nights when I would convince myself that maybe I'd been mistaken, that maybe I should go back and look again. The grief made me vulnerable, made me willing to believe in impossible things if it meant seeing her one more time. That's what the Wendigo feeds on. That desperate hope that death isn't final, that the people we've lost can somehow come back to us, It's a predator that understands human psychology better than we understand ourselves, that knows exactly which buttons to push to make us walk willingly into danger. I did eventually return to Oklahoma, but not to that hollow. Instead, I sought out the tribal elders, the ones who still remembered the old stories and the old ways. An elder named Thomas listened to my story without interruption, nodding occasionally as if he'd heard it all before. "You're lucky," he said when I finished. "Most people who go into the hollow don't come out. Those who do are changed. The Wendigo gets into your head, into your heart, and it never fully leaves. You'll carry a piece of that hunger with you always." He was right. Even now, years later, I sometimes feel it. A coldness in my chest. A hollowness that no amount of food or companionship can fill. The Wendigo marked me that day, claimed a small piece of my spirit. And on quiet nights when I'm alone, I can still hear voices calling from a place I'll never return to, promising reunion with those I've lost, if only I'll come back to the hollow. But I won't go, because I know the truth now. Some things are worse than grief, worse than loneliness, worse than the pain of loss. And one of those things lives in a hollow in Oklahoma, wearing the faces of the dead and waiting for the living to be foolish enough to answer when it calls. What would you do if you heard the voice of someone you loved calling from a place they couldn't possibly be? The Highway 83 motel appeared out of the darkness like a mirage, its neon vacancy sign flickering weakly against the Nebraska night. I'd been driving for 12 hours straight, fighting to keep my eyes open, when I finally admitted I needed to stop. The motel was a single-story structure, the kind that was probably built in the 50s and hadn't been updated since. Its white paint was yellowed and peeling, and the parking lot was cracked asphalt sprouting weeds. But it had a light on in what appeared to be an office, and that was enough for me. What struck me as odd, even through my exhaustion, was the complete absence of vehicles. The parking lot was empty, no cars, no trucks, nothing. For a motel advertising vacancy, it seemed strange that there wouldn't be at least one other traveler taking advantage of a cheap room for the night. But I was too tired to care. I just wanted a bed and a few hours of sleep before continuing my journey. The office was small and cramped, smelling of stale cigarettes and old carpet. Behind the desk sat a man who looked as ancient as the motel itself, his face a road map of wrinkles, his eyes rheumy and unfocused. He looked up when I entered, and for a moment I could swear he seemed surprised, almost startled to see me. "Need a room," I said, pulling out my wallet. He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he slowly reached under the desk and produced a key attached to a plastic tag with the number 7 printed on it. $30, cash only. I paid him and took the key, noticing how cold it was to the touch, as if it had been sitting in a freezer. "Quiet night?" I asked, trying to make conversation. "Every night's quiet here," he said, his voice like gravel scraping against concrete. "Room's at the end. Don't open your door after midnight, no matter what you hear." The warning should have alarmed me, but I was too exhausted to process it properly. I thanked him and headed back out into the night, walking along the covered walkway that ran the length of the motel. My room was indeed at the far end, the last door before the building terminated in darkness. The room was exactly what I expected. A double bed with a faded floral comforter, a television that probably didn't work, a bathroom with rust stains in the sink, and carpet that had seen better decades. But it was clean enough, and the bed looked comfortable. I locked the door, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto the mattress without bothering to undress. I'm not sure how long I slept before the sounds woke me. At first, I thought I was dreaming. A low murmuring, like multiple conversations happening just beyond my hearing. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling, listening. The sounds were coming from outside, from the walkway in front of my room. Voices, dozens of them, maybe more, all talking at once in a constant stream of whispered conversation. I could hear footsteps too, pacing back and forth, the sound of doors opening and closing, the scrape of keys and locks. The motel had come alive while I slept. Relief washed over me initially. Other guests had arrived, that's all it was. The emptiness of the parking lot must have been a fluke of timing. I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep. But something about the sounds bothered me. The voices never got louder or softer, never moved away or came closer. They maintained the same constant volume, the same indistinct quality, like a recording stuck on loop. Curiosity got the better of me. I climbed out of bed and moved to the window, carefully pulling aside the thin curtain to peer out at the walkway. What I saw made my blood run cold. The walkway was full of shadows. Not people, but shadows. Dark, human-shaped silhouettes that moved and gestured as if in conversation, but cast no physical form, no substance. They paced back and forth in front of doors, their shadow hands reaching for shadow keys, inserting them into locks that clicked open to reveal rooms full of more shadows. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering. This couldn't be real. I was overtired, hallucinating from too many hours on the road. That had to be the explanation. I squeezed my eyes shut, counted to 10 and looked again. The shadows were still there. And now, some of them had stopped their endless routines and were turning toward my window, as if they'd sensed me watching. I dropped the curtain and backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. That's when I heard it. A soft knock on my door. 3 taps, polite and patient. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knock came again, and with it, a voice. "Excuse me, do you have the time?" It was a woman's voice, pleasant and ordinary, the kind of question one traveler might ask another. Every instinct I had screamed at me not to answer, not to open that door. I remembered the clerk's warning. Don't open your door after midnight. I glanced at the digital clock on the nightstand. The numbers glowed a steady 12:47 a.m. "I know you're in there," the voice continued, still pleasant. "I saw your light on. I just need to know what time it is." My watch stopped. I pressed myself against the far wall, putting as much distance between myself and the door as possible. "Go away," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I need help." The voice had changed slightly, taken on an edge of desperation. "Please, I don't know where I am. I don't know how I got here. Can you just open the door and tell me what's happening?" More voices joined the first. A man's voice. I've been trying to check out for hours, but nobody's at the desk. A child's voice. "Mommy, I'm scared. Why won't they help us?" An elderly voice. "I just want to go home. I've been here so long." They all spoke at once, a chorus of confusion and fear. And beneath it all was a pleading desperation that tugged at something in my chest. These weren't monsters. They were people, lost and frightened, needing help. My hand moved toward the door handle almost of its own accord. They needed help. I could help them. All I had to do was open the door. I was inches from the lock when I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror above the dresser. And in that reflection, I saw something that stopped me cold. The shadow of my hand reaching for the door wasn't quite right. It was too long, too thin, and it moved a fraction of a second before my actual hand did, as if anticipating my movements. Horror crashed over me like a wave. I snatched my hand back and stared at the mirror. My shadow was wrong. It was changing, elongating, becoming less human and more like the shapes I'd seen on the walkway. Whatever was on the other side of that door wasn't trying to get in. It was trying to get me to come out. "No," I said firmly, backing away. "I'm not opening the door." The voices outside changed instantly. The pleasantness, the fear, the desperation, all of it vanished, replaced by something cold and hungry. They began to chant in unison. Words in a language I didn't recognize, harsh and guttural sounds that seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. No bars, no service, nothing. I was completely cut off. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and the door began to shake in its frame. The lights flickered, and in the moments of darkness, I could see shadows seeping under the door crack, pooling on the carpet, reaching toward me like grasping fingers. I did the only thing I could think of. I pushed the dresser in front of the door, then piled the chair on the top of it, creating a barricade. The shadows recoiled slightly, as if the physical barrier had some effect on them. The chanting continued, but it seemed more distant now, less immediate. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the bed, every light in the room turned on, watching the door and the shadows that crept beneath it. They never stopped trying, never gave up, maintaining their assault until the first rays of dawn broke through the window. With the sunrise, everything stopped. The voices cut off mid-chant. The shadows retreated and vanished. The oppressive atmosphere that had filled the room all night lifted like fog burning away. I cautiously approached the window and looked out at the walkway. It was empty. No shadows. No movement. Nothing. I threw my belongings into my bag and moved the barricade away from the door. My hand shook as I unlocked it and peered outside. The morning was clear and quiet, birds singing in the distance. The motel looked abandoned in the daylight, even more run down than it had seemed the night before. The office was empty. No ancient clerk, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The cash I'd paid was gone from the desk. On impulse, I checked the other rooms, using my key to open them one by one. Every single room was empty. No furniture, no beds, nothing but bare walls and dust-covered floors. Room 7, my room, was the only one that was furnished. I got in my car and drove away without looking back. It wasn't until I reached the next town that I stopped at a diner and asked about the Highway 83 motel. The waitress looked at me strangely. "There hasn't been a motel on Highway 83 for 20 years, she said. "Burned down in the 90s. Took 15 people with it. Guests who couldn't get out in time. What would you do if you spent the night in a place where every room was occupied by the dead?" The summer I turned 16 was the summer the lights came to our Kansas town. It started on a humid July night when the wheat fields were at their peak, golden stalks swaying in the breeze under a star-filled sky. I was sitting on my front porch with my best friend Marcus, trying to escape the heat inside the house when we first saw them. Strange bluish lights hovering above the Henderson wheat field about a half-mile from town. At first, we thought they were helicopters, or maybe drones. But they moved wrong. Too smooth and too deliberate, executing patterns that seemed impossible for any aircraft we knew. The lights would cluster together, then spread apart, forming geometric shapes that held for a few seconds before dissolving into chaos and reforming into something new. They pulsed with a soft, hypnotic glow that seemed to pull at something deep in my chest. "We should check that out," Marcus said, already standing up. I should have said no. I should have recognized the strangeness for what it was and stayed exactly where I was. But 16-year-olds don't make smart decisions, especially on boring summer nights in small towns where nothing ever happens. So I agreed, and we grabbed our bikes and headed toward the field. By the time we reached the edge of the Hendersons' property, we realized we weren't alone. Half the town seemed to have the same idea. There were dozens of people streaming across the fields, all walking toward the lights with the same mesmerized expression on their faces. I recognized neighbors, teachers, the sheriff, the pastor from the Methodist church, people of all ages, all moving in the same direction as if pulled by invisible strings. The wheat came up to our shoulders as we pushed through it, following the crowd. The lights were closer now, maybe 100 yards away, and I could see them more clearly. They weren't solid. They seemed to shift and shimmer like looking at something through water. And they were beautiful. More beautiful than anything I'd ever seen. The blue glow seemed to seep into my vision, into my thoughts, making everything else fade away until all that mattered was getting closer to those lights. Marcus grabbed my arm, and I realized he'd stopped walking. "Something's wrong," he said, his voice cutting through the fog in my mind. "Look at everyone. Really look." I forced myself to focus on the people around us instead of the lights. What I saw chilled me despite the warm night air. They weren't just walking. They were moving in perfect synchronization, their steps matching exactly, their heads tilted at identical angles. And their eyes were wrong, reflecting the blue light in a way that made them look almost inhuman, like the glow had gotten inside them somehow. "We need to leave," I said, suddenly terrified. But when I tried to turn back, my legs wouldn't obey. They kept moving forward, carrying me toward the lights against my will. I looked at Marcus and saw the same panic in his face. He couldn't stop either. The crowd reached the lights, and up close, they were even stranger. They hovered about 15 feet off the ground, each one roughly the size of a basketball, but with edges that seemed to blur and extend beyond what should be possible. Standing directly beneath them, I could feel something emanating from the lights. Not heat, but a pressure, like the air itself was being compressed around us. Then the humming started. It was so low at first that I felt it more than heard it, a vibration that resonated in my bones. But it grew steadily louder, and with it came a sound that might have been voices or music or something that existed between the two. The lights began to pulse faster, brighter, and the wheat around us started to move in rippling waves despite there being no wind. That's when I noticed the time. My watch read 11:47 p.m. I remember thinking we'd been walking for about 20 minutes, which meant we'd left my house around 11:30. But that couldn't be right. We'd left while it was still twilight, maybe around 9 o'clock. I looked up at the sky and saw that the stars had moved, their positions wrong for the time my watch claimed. The lights suddenly flared with blinding intensity, and I had to shield my eyes. When I could see again, everything had changed. The wheat field was gone. We were standing in darkness, so complete it felt solid, pressing in from all sides. The only illumination came from the lights themselves, which now surrounded us completely, forming a dome of blue luminescence overhead. People were screaming now, the spell broken by the sudden transportation to this impossible place. The perfect synchronization shattered as panic took hold. But there was nowhere to run. The darkness beyond the lights seemed infinite and hungry, waiting to swallow anyone foolish enough to step into it. The humming intensified, becoming almost painful, and shapes began to form in the lights. Tall, impossibly thin silhouettes that might have been figures or might have been something my mind created to make sense of what I was seeing. They moved through the blue glow like swimmers moving through water, circling us, observing us. I don't know how long we stood there. Time felt wrong in that place, stretching and compressing in ways that made no sense. Minutes might have been hours, or hours might have been seconds. All I know is that the shapes in the lights eventually seemed to finish whatever they were doing, and the humming began to fade. The darkness receded, and suddenly we were back in the wheat field. But something was wrong. The wheat was different, shorter, greener, like it was several weeks younger than it had been, and the air felt different too, cooler and damper, carrying the scent of rain even though the sky was clear. People began to stumble away, confused and disoriented. Marcus and I stayed close together, both of us too frightened to speak. We made our way back to town, and that's when we realized the full extent of what had happened. My watch still read 11:47 p.m., but it was running. The second hand ticked forward normally, and when we reached Main Street, the bank's clock tower showed 11:52. But that was impossible. We'd been in that dark place for what felt like hours. Unless time had stopped while we were there, or moved differently, or... My thoughts were interrupted by Marcus pointing at a newspaper dispenser. The date on the paper inside was wrong. It wasn't July anymore. According to the newspaper, it was late June, 3 weeks earlier than when we'd seen the lights. We ran to my house, and my parents greeted us with concern, asking where we'd been for the past hour. Just an hour, they said. We'd left around 10:45 to check out some strange lights people had reported, and now it was nearly midnight. They didn't remember us sitting on the porch that evening. They didn't remember July at all. Over the next few days, the full truth emerged through whispered conversations and shared confusion. Everyone who'd followed the lights had the same experience. Hours missing, memories of a dark place, and the impossible discovery that we'd somehow traveled backward in time by 3 weeks. We all remembered the future that no longer existed, events that hadn't happened yet, conversations that would now unfold differently because we remembered having them before. The authorities tried to explain it away as mass hallucination or some kind of psychological event. But they couldn't explain the physical evidence. People who'd gotten haircuts in that missing 3 weeks suddenly had longer hair again. A broken bone that had been healing was suddenly fresh. A woman who'd been pregnant told everyone she was 5 weeks along when she should have been 8. The lights never came back. The wheat field where it happened grew normally that summer, and the town tried to move on, tried to forget. But those of us who were there carry the memories of those lost weeks, trapped in our minds like ghosts of a future that never was. The worst part isn't the missing time or the impossible journey backward. It's the knowledge that we don't know why. What were those lights? What were the shapes we saw? Why did they take us? And most terrifying of all, what did they do to us during those hours in the darkness? Sometimes I catch myself remembering events from those 3 weeks that no longer exist, conversations I had with people who don't remember having them. Sometimes I wake up in the night, convinced I can hear that low humming sound. And I have to check my watch obsessively to make sure time is still moving normally. And sometimes, on clear summer nights, when the wheat fields are at their peak, I look out at the Kansas sky and wonder if the lights will return. If they'll take us again, steal more time, send us further back, or perhaps forward into a future we're not meant to see. because deep down, I think they marked us that night. I think whatever they did in that dark place left something behind, a connection we can't break. And one day, they might come back to finish whatever they started. What would you do if you lost weeks of your life and found yourself trapped in a past you'd already lived, knowing things that haven't happened yet? I've always been fascinated by old cemeteries. The history they contain, the stories carved into weathered headstones, the peace that settles over them like a blanket. So when I was hiking through the Dakota's backcountry and stumbled upon an overgrown graveyard that wasn't marked on any map, I was thrilled rather than disturbed. At least, I was thrilled at first. The cemetery sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense pine trees, hidden from any trail or road. I only found it because I'd gotten turned around and was bushwhacking my way back to what I hoped was the right direction. The iron fence that once enclosed it had mostly collapsed, rusty bars jutting up from the undergrowth like broken bones. Headstones tilted at odd angles, some completely toppled, others barely visible beneath decades of moss and vines. It was beautiful in a melancholy way, frozen in time and forgotten by the world. I pulled out my phone to take some pictures, but I had no signal out here. Not surprising given how remote the area was. I'd have to rely on memory and the photos I could upload later when I got back to civilization. The dates on the headstones were old, most from the late 1800s and early 1900s. Pioneer families, I assumed. People who tried to make a life in this harsh landscape and been buried where they'd lived and died. Some of the names were still legible. Sarah Mackenzie, beloved wife and mother. Jonathan Reeves, taken too soon. Mary Catherine Winters, may she rest in eternal peace. I was documenting the names in my notebook, a habit I'd developed to later research the families and their histories. When I found the headstone that changed everything. It was newer than the others, the granite still relatively smooth and the engraving deep and clear. And the name carved into it was mine. Not similar to mine, not someone with the same first name. My exact full name, middle name and all. My birth date was correct too, carved in precise letters that seemed to mock me from the stone. But the death date was wrong. It showed a date 5 years in the future. My hands started shaking as I stared at it, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. This had to be a coincidence. Maybe someone with the same name as me, same birthday, same middle name. The odds were astronomical, but not impossible. Except, beneath the dates was an inscription. Beloved son, brother, and friend. Lost in the Dakota's backcountry while hiking alone. Finally found and brought home. Ice flooded my veins. I was hiking alone in the Dakota's backcountry, right now. I stumbled backward from the headstone, nearly tripping over a collapsed section of fence. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. I forced myself to breathe, to think rationally. Someone was playing a prank on me. Somehow they knew I'd be here and planted a fake headstone with my information on it. But who? And how? I hadn't told anyone my exact hiking route. I'd barely decided on it myself, making turns based on whim and instinct. I turned to leave, to get out of this place and back to my car, back to safety and sanity. That's when I saw the other headstone, my sister's name, her birth date, a death date next year. Taken by sudden illness, survived by her loving family. My legs gave out, and I fell to my knees in the overgrown grass. No, this wasn't happening. I crawled forward, frantically pushing aside weeds and vines, uncovering more headstones. My mother's name, death date in 3 years. My father's name, death date in 7 years. My best friend from college, my boss, my neighbors. Everyone I knew, everyone I cared about. All with their names and birth dates correctly listed. All with death dates in the future. The cemetery wasn't old and forgotten. It was a record of deaths that hadn't happened yet. A catalog of the future, carved in stone and waiting. I scrambled to my feet, panic overriding rational thought. I had to get out of here. I had to warn people. I had to... What? Tell everyone I knew that I'd found their future graves? Who would believe me? Who could believe something so impossible? I ran toward the tree line, desperate to escape this nightmare. But the cemetery wasn't done with me yet. As I reached the collapsed fence, I saw movement among the headstones. Figures, translucent and shimmering like heat mirages, rising from the graves. They had faces I recognized, my own face, my sister's, my parents'. Dozens of people I knew, all staring at me with hollow eyes. They didn't speak, but I could feel their accusation, their judgment. I was the intruder here. I was the one who didn't belong. This was their place, their future, and I had no right to witness it. One of the figures stepped forward, the one with my face. It looked older than me, tired and worn in ways I wasn't yet, as if it had lived the years between now and the death date on my stone. It raised a hand and pointed back toward the center of the cemetery, a clear command. Look, against every instinct screaming at me to run. I turned and looked. New headstones were rising from the ground, pushing up through soil and grass like teeth. These ones had names I didn't recognize yet, but dates that were current. People who were dying now, today, at this very moment. The cemetery wasn't just showing the future, it was recording the present, documenting every death as it happened. And then I understood. This place existed outside of normal time. It was a collection point, a record keeper, a space where past, present, and future deaths converged. The cemetery I'd thought was abandoned and forgotten was actually very much alive, constantly updating, constantly expanding to accommodate new arrivals. The figure with my face moved closer, and I could see details now that terrified me. It had injuries, a broken leg, cuts and bruises, signs of trauma that matched the inscription about being lost in the backcountry. This wasn't just my future death. It was showing me how I would die. No, I whispered. I can change this. I can make different choices. The figure shook its head slowly, sadly. Around us, the other spirits did the same, a chorus of silent denial. The dates on the stones weren't predictions, they were certainties. Time didn't work the way I thought it did. The future was already written, already set, and this cemetery was proof of its inevitability. Rage replaced fear. I refused to accept this. I wouldn't let some supernatural graveyard dictate my fate or the fates of everyone I loved. I pulled out my phone, intending to take pictures as evidence, as proof that this place existed and needed to be destroyed or sealed off or... The screen showed the date and time. But something was wrong. The date kept changing, flickering between different days, different months, different years. Time was unstable here, and the longer I stayed, the more reality itself seemed to warp and bend. The spirits were closing in now, a circle of the not yet dead surrounding me. They reached out with hands that weren't quite solid, trying to touch me, trying to pull me down into the ground where my grave waited. I could feel their cold radiating through the warm afternoon air, could smell earth and decay, despite the flowers blooming around us. I broke through their circle and ran, crashing through underbrush and low-hanging branches, not caring about direction, only distance. Behind me, I could hear whispers, not words, but the sensation of voices. Thousands of them, all the dead from past and future, crying out in a language beyond human comprehension. I don't know how long I ran. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, trees appearing identical, the terrain looping back on itself. Several times I was certain I'd circled back to the cemetery, seeing the same collapsed fence and tilted headstones. But I kept running, kept pushing forward, until finally I burst onto a hiking trail I recognized. Other hikers were there, a young couple with backpacks, looking startled by my sudden appearance and obvious distress. I must have looked insane, covered in scratches and dirt, gasping for breath, eyes wild with fear. They asked if I was okay, if I needed help, but I could barely respond. I just pointed back toward where I'd come from and managed to gasp out a warning about the cemetery. They exchanged concerned glances and told me there was no cemetery in that direction. They'd hiked this area dozens of times and never seen anything matching my description. One of them offered me water and suggested I might be dehydrated or suffering from heat exhaustion. Maybe they were right. Maybe I'd hallucinated the whole thing. But when I got home and unpacked my gear, I found something in my pocket that I knew hadn't been there before. A small piece of granite, smooth and polished, with text carved into it. My name, my birth date, and that date 5 years in the future. I keep it in a drawer now, hidden away where I don't have to look at it. But I know it's there, a constant reminder that somewhere in the Dakota's backcountry, there's a cemetery that knows exactly when and how everyone will die. And my grave is waiting, patient and inevitable, counting down the years until I return to claim it. What would you do if you found your own gravestone? Your death already carved in stone years before it happens? I've traveled across the United States more times than I can count, documenting strange places and unusual stories for my blog. I've seen weird roadside attractions, bizarre local customs, and plenty of towns that could be described as quirky or eccentric. But nothing prepared me for Millbrook, Nebraska, a town that, on the surface, seemed perfectly normal until you noticed the one detail that made your skin crawl. There were no dogs, not a single one. I arrived on a sunny September afternoon, pulling off the highway because I needed gas and coffee. Millbrook looked like 1,000 other small Great Plains towns, a main street with a few shops, a diner, a church with a white steeple, houses with neat lawns and American flags. People waved as I drove past, friendly and welcoming. Everything seemed pleasant and ordinary. I parked at the gas station and went inside to pay. The attendant was a middle-aged woman with a warm smile who asked if I was just passing through or planning to stay a while. We made small talk while my card processed, and I mentioned I was a travel blogger, always looking for interesting local stories. "Well, we've got plenty of history here," she said. "Founded in 1882, survived the Dust Bowl. Got a nice little museum downtown if you're interested." As we talked, I noticed something odd. Through the window, I could see several people walking along the sidewalk, a few kids riding bikes, an elderly couple sitting on a bench. But no one was walking a dog. No dogs in yards, no dogs barking in the distance, no evidence of dogs at all. "Do people here not like dogs?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The woman's smile faltered for just a moment. "Oh, we like them just fine. We just don't have any. Haven't for years. Dogs don't do well here. Best not to have them." Her discomfort was obvious, and my curiosity was piqued. I thanked her and headed to the diner, deciding to spend a few hours in Millbrook to investigate. blogger in me smelled a story, and the part of me that couldn't resist mysteries needed answers. I ordered coffee and pie from a waitress named Linda. When I mentioned the lack of dogs, her expression changed instantly, the friendliness draining away and replaced by fear. "You should leave," she said quietly. "Finish your coffee and go. Don't ask questions about the dogs. They know. They always know when someone brings a dog here or even talks about bringing one, and they don't allow it." "Who's they?" I asked, but she walked away without answering. I spent the afternoon walking around Millbrook, observing and taking notes. Not only were there no dogs, but there was no evidence dogs had ever existed here. No dog houses, no leashes, no dog food in stores. But cats were everywhere. Dozens of them, lounging on porches, watching from windows, following me as I walked. Their eyes tracked my movements with an intelligence that felt unsettling. As evening approached, I decided to stay overnight at the town's small motel. The clerk, an elderly man with tired eyes, seemed resigned when I checked in. "Noticed the cats, did you?" he said without prompting. Hard not to. And the lack of dogs. He sighed deeply. "Been that way since 1987. That's when the last dog disappeared. People don't talk about it much anymore, but those of us who were here remember." He told me the story. Millbrook used to be like any other town, with plenty of dogs. Then strange things started happening. Dogs would become agitated for no reason, barking at empty air, cowering from invisible threats. They stopped eating, stopped sleeping, just stood and stared at nothing with their hackles raised. Then they started disappearing. One by one, dogs vanished from locked yards, from inside houses, even from moving cars. Within a month, every dog in Millbrook was gone. Search parties found nothing, no bodies, no tracks, no evidence of what had taken them. "And the cats?" I asked. "They came after," he said. "Showed up in droves, like they'd been waiting. And they've been here ever since, watching everything. Reporting back to whatever it is that lives beneath this town." "Beneath the town?" He looked at me with hollow eyes. "The old mineshaft system. Closed down in the 60s after a collapse killed 12 men. The town sealed the entrances, but there are still ways in if you know where to look. And things live down there now. Things that hate dogs because dogs can sense them, can smell them, can warn people. But cats serve them." I wanted to dismiss this as local superstition, but something in his certainty made me believe him. That night, unable to sleep, I stood at my motel window and watched the street below. Cats moved through the darkness like shadows, dozens of them converging at various points before dispersing again. They were patrolling, I realized. Watching. Guarding. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it. A low growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It rumbled up through the ground, vibrating through the building's foundation. The cats scattered instantly, disappearing into the night. And in that moment of stillness, I heard something else. Scratching, coming from beneath the floor. I grabbed my things and left immediately, not bothering to check out, just throwing my bag in the car and driving. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I saw them in my rearview mirror. The cats, sitting in a perfect line across the road, watching me leave with luminous eyes that reflected my taillights. But the most disturbing part came later. When I got home and developed the photos I'd taken in Millbrook, there was something in every single image. In the background, partially hidden in shadows or behind objects, were shapes. Large, hunched figures with too many limbs and faces that were almost human, but fundamentally wrong. They'd been there the entire time, invisible to my eyes, but captured by my camera. lurking at the edges of that cursed town. I tried to post about Millbrook on my blog, but every attempt failed. The files corrupted, the posts deleted themselves, my computer crashed repeatedly. And then the cats started showing up at my apartment. I don't own a cat. I don't live near any strays. But they appear on my balcony, sitting and staring through the glass, watching me with those same intelligent, knowing eyes. I haven't been back to Millbrook, and I never will. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that low growling coming from somewhere beneath my building. And I wonder if distance really matters. I wonder if leaving was ever really an option. Or if noticing the absence of dogs in that town marked me somehow, connected me to whatever hunts beneath the Great Plains. The cats are still watching. They're always watching. And they're making sure I never tell anyone what really happened to the dogs of Millbrook, what's still happening, what might happen to any dog foolish enough to enter that town's limits. Because the things that live beneath don't just hate dogs. They hate anything that can warn us of danger, anything that can protect us from threats we can't see. And they've claimed Millbrook as their territory, using the cats as their eyes and ears, making sure no one ever brings a dog back to disturb their hunting grounds. What would you do if you discovered an entire town controlled by something lurking beneath the surface? Using innocent animals as spies, while hunting anything that could expose them? If these stories have sent chills down your spine and kept you on the edge of your seat, we've only scratched the surface of the horrors waiting in the darkness. Subscribe to Verified Fears to join our horror family and never miss another terrifying tale from the shadows of small-town America. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and prepare yourself for the nightmares we'll uncover together. Until next time, horror family, stay vigilant, trust your instincts, and remember that some towns have secrets darker than you can imagine.